This video was brought to you by our old friends Squarespace. If you're looking to create a website, portfolio, blog, or online store, Squarespace gives you all the tools you need from start to finish. And I should know because I used Squarespace to build my production company's website, galaxyclasspictures.com. I didn't know the first thing about coding, but I didn't need to. I simply selected a template from Squarespace's vast array of options and then customized it to fit my needs. Now it's even easier thanks to Squarespace's AI-driven blueprint system, which makes creating a custom website faster and smoother than ever before. Once finished, launch your site at the click of a button and get discovered fast with Squarespace's built-in SEO tools. Jump over to Squarespace using the link below to start building your site and use the coupon code Rowan J. Coleman to get 10% off your first purchase. In 1977, director Steven Spielberg wowed audiences with the spectacular science fiction adventure Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Like his previous blockbuster Jaws, the film was mired with production problems and delays, wrapping behind schedule and over budget. Yet just like Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind became a huge critical and commercial success. This was a pattern with Spielberg's films at the time, a pattern which was interrupted by the underperformance and critical panning of his World War II comedy 1941. With his future career hanging in the balance, Spielberg, with the help of producer George Lucas, made sure his next film wouldn't spin out of control. Raiders of the Lost Ark wrapped under budget and ahead of schedule, and yet again found huge success critically, commercially, and culturally. Spielberg was once again an in-demand filmmaker, whose projects were seen as potential box office gold. But for his next film, Steven Spielberg wanted to move away from epic blockbusters and instead work on a smaller, more intimate project. While his next film would embody these traits, it was also a film which once again looked to the stars. Unlike Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial was not a long gestating passion project of Spielberg's, but rather the coalescence of multiple ideas from multiple people. Spielberg had long been toying with a story idea called Growing Up, about a child's adventures with an imaginary friend, overshadowed by the divorce of his parents and the breakup of his home, something inspired by Spielberg's own childhood. The story, which had been on the back burner for many years, was suddenly brought to the forefront in the wake of Close Encounters of the Third Kind's huge success. Columbia Pictures approached Spielberg for a sequel, but Spielberg wasn't at all interested in the idea. Instead, he proposed a spiritual sequel, a counterpoint to Close Encounters titled Night Skies. Whereas Close Encounters showed a peaceful first contact with aliens, Night Skies would show a family under siege from extraterrestrial invaders. Spielberg handed the writing duties of this new film over to John Sayles, who had penned low-budget sci-fi, action and horror films such as Roger Corman's Battle Beyond the Stars and The Howling. However, when Spielberg read the script while shooting Raiders of the Lost Ark in Tunisia, he came to realize his heart simply wasn't in such a dark and violent picture. Eventually, the concept behind Night Skies would morph into the horror film Poltergeist, which Spielberg produced. However, for the filmmaker's next directorial effort, Spielberg suddenly found himself revisiting the idea for Growing Up. While working on Raiders, Spielberg encountered Melissa Matheson, who was an aspiring screenwriter at the time and Harrison Ford's girlfriend. When Spielberg gave her the Night Skies script to look over, she came back largely unimpressed, but singled out what she thought was the strongest idea. Among the evil aliens trying to break into the family home, there was a lone friendly alien who formed a friendship with one of the family's children. And suddenly, the penny dropped for Spielberg.
And then I thought, you know something, that notion really jives with this imaginary friend concept I've been working on all my life. So I brought it to Columbia. Of course, the rest is history. They turned me down. They didn't like it.
Titled E.T. and Me, Melissa Matheson worked on the script, while Spielberg got the project up and running as a co-production between Universal and his own company Amblin Entertainment, which he had formed with producers Frank Marshall and Kathleen Kennedy. Rick Baker, creator of the special makeup effects in An American Werewolf in London, was brought on to the Night Skies project to create the aliens. However, when offered the chance to join E.T., he wasn't interested. In his place, illustrator Ed Verreau and special effects artist Carlo Rambaldi were hired to bring E.T. to life. The title character was to be childlike in size and behaviour, but also possessing of a deep intelligence. At Spielberg's suggestion, Verreau and Rambaldi combined the features of Albert Einstein, Ernest Hemingway, and Carl Sandburg, which were all rounded off around large eyes for the creature's face. Playing E.T. himself were several actors including Tamara Detrow and Pat Billen, as well as a child actor named Matthew Demerit, who was born without legs. He performed E.T.'s walking shots by balancing on his hands. Tight shots of E.T.'s hands were performed by mime artist Caprice Roth. E.T.'s final voice was performed by actress Pat Welsh, which was then augmented by sound designer Ben Burt. Playing opposite E.T. was a then 10-year-old Henry Thomas as Elliot Taylor. The casting directors searched for 6 months to find the right young actor before director Jack Fisk recommended Thomas to Spielberg. Fisk had just worked with Thomas on the film Raggedy Man. For his final audition, Spielberg asked Thomas to improvise a scene in which government agents were coming to take E.T. away. Thomas later recounted how he drew on the memory of losing his family dog for the emotion of the scene.
The president asked me to come here and get him.
I don't care what the president says, he's my best friend, and you can't take him away.
Okay, kid, you got the job.
Henry Thomas would go on to have a successful career in the following decades, appearing in Legends of the Fall and Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York. Most recently, Thomas has become a regular collaborator of master horror filmmaker Mike Flanagan, appearing in 3 movies and 5 TV shows directed by Flanagan. Dee Wallace, who was cast as Elliot's mother Mary, was no stranger to horror, having appeared in The Howling, and she would later appear in Critters and Peter Jackson's The Frighteners. Playing the youngest of the Taylors was a then 6-year-old Drew Barrymore. Barrymore came from a long line of actors and had already appeared in the film Altered States. Spielberg first became aware of her when she auditioned for Poltergeist. However, Spielberg offered her the role of Gertie in E.T. instead. Like Thomas, Barrymore would go on to have a successful and prolific acting career after E.T., most famously appearing in the 2000s reboot of Charlie's Angels. Ironically, the oldest of the young actors, Robert McNaughton, had the least feature film experience. However, McNaughton did have extensive theatre acting experience before he took on the role of Michael in E.T. Due to his background, Spielberg appointed Michael as a kind of acting mentor to his younger co-stars. Peter Coyote had previously met Spielberg when he auditioned for Indiana Jones. Though he lost out on that role, Spielberg liked the actor and offered him the part of Keys, a mysterious scientist searching for E.T. Filming mostly took place in suburbs in the San Fernando Valley in California, as well as the coastal redwoods in Northern California. While there was a lot of location shooting, the production also made use of Laird International Studios, where they built all interior sets, as well as several exterior sets, such as the clearing where E.T.'s spaceship lands and Elliot's back garden. For these sets to look convincing, Spielberg worked with cinematographer Alan Davio to create a high-contrast atmospheric look full of shadows and coloured light. Like Close Encounters, Spielberg demonstrated an innate ability to work with child actors. For one thing, he chose to shoot the film in complete chronological order to make it easier for the kids to understand what was happening in the story. At Melissa Matheson's suggestion, Spielberg had the script printed out on small cards to make it easier for the young cast to learn. When he discovered Drew Barrymore was continuing to speak to the E.T. puppet even when the cameras weren't rolling, Spielberg asked 2 of Rambaldi's team to animate the puppet between takes just to keep Barrymore happy. Little touches like this contributed to a positive and relaxed, but also productive on-set atmosphere. For the climactic bike chase at the end of the movie, expert BMX riders Robert Cardoza, Greg Mays, and David Lee doubled for the child actors for all the riding and stunts. Filming wrapped after 61 days, 4 days ahead of schedule. For the visual effects of the film, Spielberg enlisted the talents at ILM, supervised by Dennis Murin, who had previously worked on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The alien spaceship was a motion-controlled miniature, built by artists who had previously used the same techniques in Star Wars. For the iconic flying bicycles, actors were filmed on bikes mounted to gimbal rigs which could pitch and yaw the bikes as needed. The actors were filmed against blue screen with an aerial photography plate composited into the shot afterwards. For the widest shots, the actors and bikes were replaced entirely by go-motion puppets, an advancement on stop-motion which added motion blur to the traditionally stuttery style of stop-motion animation. For the music of the film, Spielberg once again brought on his regular collaborator John Williams. Williams composed a range of options for the main theme of the film, but Spielberg liked them all so much, he decided to include all of them in the film in various forms.
The end part of that film, beginning with the bicycle chase, as the little boys are trying to take E.T. back to the mothership and escape the police and get him safely back. About 10, maybe 15 minutes of very difficult music, all of it planned to catch all of these sync points, these points of accent. We have the bicycle achieving escape velocity, and finally very sentimental dialogue at the end when E.T. says, "I'll be right here, goodbye." And a fanfare when the spaceship goes up. And another fanfare when it turns left. And I was having a very difficult time with the orchestra I would make maybe a good take for the first 5, but maybe off the next 2 cues and then on further cues. But I remember it so well, Steven coming out to the podium and saying, "I will take the film off the screen so you can just play the music with the orchestra with its natural phrasing, the way it ebbs and flows in its own way, and then conform the film to what is the best musical performance of that thing." Very unusual. We usually have to slavishly phrase the music to the cuts of the film. When we had the musical performance we felt gave us the most lift and the most sense of exultation at the end of the film, Steven then laid the music track against the film and made a few editorial adjustments to conform to the music. And I think part of the reason the end of the film has such a kind of operatic sense of completion may be partly the result of this wedding of the musical accents with Steven's film editing.
Compared to the ambition and scale of Spielberg's previous films, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial was a far more relaxed production. From script to screen, the film had taken less than a year and a half to complete. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival on the 26th of May, 1982. If you're enjoying this retrospective review, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, or if you want to support this channel more directly, join my Patreon where you can see videos like this early, uncut, and ad-free. I received some pushback for my criticisms of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. While I could see what it was trying to do, and I understand why the film is so revered, for me, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial takes those same ideas and distills them into a more coherent and emotionally rich narrative. I remember E.T. being on TV when I was a child, but I hadn't watched the film properly in well over a decade. After I re-watched E.T. for this video, I was frankly gobsmacked by the quality of the film, and it has only gone up in my estimation the more I've thought about it. E.T. is Spielberg using his astonishing technical skill to explore a deeply personal story with stunning results. It is a genuine masterpiece of a film which has been instantly catapulted onto my list of favourite movies of all time. E.T. is, of course, about growing up, but more specifically, it's about holding on to our childhood as we grow up. Children are curious, innocent, optimistic, and embrace fantasy, whether that be in the form of fantasy worlds or fantasy people. These traits often slip away from us as we get older and we're confronted with the harsh realities of adulthood. Curiosity becomes complacency, innocence becomes insecurity, optimism becomes cynicism, and a love for fantasy is drilled out of us by the drudgery of everyday life. E.T. is about growing up while still holding on to those childlike qualities. For we all must grow up eventually, but that doesn't mean we have to lose those qualities. Rather than stunting us, holding on to our childhood can in fact uplift us as human beings. I feel it's worth stating the core idea of the narrative in this way to better illustrate how seamlessly Spielberg and Matheson wove this idea into virtually every single scene of the film, consciously or otherwise. We begin not in the real world, but in the fantastical, with the alien spacecraft silhouetted by moonlight and shrouded in fog. Rather than the speculative science of the alien scene in Close Encounters, this spaceship, these aliens, and their accoutrements appear deliberately toy-like. The scene looks and feels like something a child would imagine, but suddenly this charmingly mysterious scene is intruded upon by an adult presence, spearheaded by the vaguely threatening figure known only as Keys. Spielberg's choice to hide the adult faces and emphasize the jangling keys is not only a great way of creating intrigue around his character, but it's another symbol serving the core narrative. After all, what better symbol of adulthood than a looming figure with the literal keys to access all those forbidden places children aren't allowed to go? With one simple motif, Keys is established as a restrictive authority figure which the childlike E.T. must escape from. Immediately after this introductory scene, we meet Elliot, desperately wanting to join in on a game of Dungeons & Dragons, a fantasy game, and being excluded from it. He is a child who wants to play, but he is forced to remain in the real world, to carry out the mundane task of collecting pizza from the delivery guy. This confinement to reality and exclusion from fantasy continues even after Elliot's first encounter with E.T.
Maybe it was an iguana.
It was no iguana.
Maybe you just probably imagined it.
I couldn't have imagined it.
And just as we start to wonder why Elliot's childhood seems so distraught, this scene provides the answer.
Maybe you ought to call your father and tell him about it.
I can't. He's in Mexico with Sally.
Now, not to get too personal, but this is something I can relate to on a pretty deep level. Elliot's childhood, which is supposed to be a time for imagination, games, and fun, is suddenly shattered by a harsh adult event which threatens to force Elliot to grow up much faster than he'd like. If Spielberg has a talent for anything, it is depicting domestic family life with an authenticity and charm no other filmmaker has quite matched. A house full of clutter, siblings arguing with each other, and a single mother trying desperately to hold the home together. Dee Wallace's performance as Mary in particular is excellent. A multifaceted character who is clearly dealing with a deep-rooted pain she's doing her best never to show to her children. It makes her moments of genuine happiness or unintended amusement very endearing.
It was nothing like that, penis breath!
Elliot! Sit down.
A combination of unspoken acting cues and subtextually rich lines of dialogue paints a clear and believable picture of this fractured family dynamic in a shockingly small amount of time. As the youngest, Gertie isn't fully able to understand what's happening with her family, while Michael, as the oldest, grasps events completely. With an absent father, Michael, despite still being a minor, is trying his best to fill in as the proverbial man of the house.
Damn it, why don't you grow up? Think how other people feel for a change.
While still being very much a kid himself, Elliot then, as the middle child, is literally caught between these two states. Too old to play dress-up with his sister, but young enough to push back against the burgeoning adulthood of his older brother. He's growing up, but he doesn't want to. The design of E.T. himself encapsulates the story's central idea. A lot of jokes are often made about how E.T. is kind of ugly. Yes, he has big cute eyes, but he's also wrinkly and gangly and has a voice like a chain smoker. But once again, I think this is quite deliberate. E.T. is childlike in size and behaviour, he's fascinated by the world around him and deeply curious about Elliot's life. Despite being an alien from another world, E.T. is earnest and empathetic, he's an innocent creature. Yet E.T. looks and sounds old. He has a wrinkled face and a low, croaky voice. He possesses innocence but also wisdom. This makes him come across as essentially ageless. He is endearing the way a rambunctious child is, but also the way a quirky elderly relative is. To Elliot, E.T. is a magical imaginary friend, a caregiver, a sibling, and a parental figure all at once. He is the embodiment of childhood surviving maturity. Much of the film's second act continues highlighting these dualities between childhood and adulthood, as well as the mundane and the fantastic. The classroom is an obvious example of the former. While still empathetically connected to E.T., Elliot gets drunk for the first time in his life, but in a fun, kiddie way. Henry Thomas is simply hysterical in his drunk acting. But then comes that dose of cold, harsh reality as the teacher prepares the pupils to dissect frogs. Elliot choosing to free the frogs is not a sign of stunting, but uplifting. By staying in tune with his emotions and rejecting the clinical view of his teacher, he not only frees the poor frogs, but he even works up the courage to kiss a girl he likes. It's a wonderfully symbolic scene while also being a delight to watch. It's full of Chuck Jones and Ernst Lubitsch-inspired touches, which make it all the more charming. The latter duality of the mundane and fantastic is reflected in the heavily atmospheric cinematography. The use of shadow injects mystery and a sense of the unknown and uncanny into this familiar suburban setting. Many shots in Elliot's back garden or the forest have a dreamlike quality to them, in their use of thick fog and colourful diffused light. But it's the striking image of agents invading the family home wearing NASA spacesuits which is pure nightmare fuel. Like the mothership rising up behind Devil's Tower in Close Encounters, it's not an image which makes much logical sense, but emotionally it's an inspired choice. Spielberg's use of framing and lighting, combined with John Williams' music, makes the arrival of these government agents feel like the real alien invasion. But this nightmare fuel soon gives way once again to that cold, harsh reality. Aside from Peter Coyote as Keyes, Spielberg hired real doctors to play the doctors working on E.T. as he slowly dies, which lends extra authenticity to their mannerisms and procedures. It's such a visceral sequence that one can forget they're operating on an extraterrestrial. A cynic's version of E.T. would have had the movie end with the alien's death. Having entertained his fantasy for most of the movie, this cold shock back to reality would seem to force Elliot to finally grow up. But for Spielberg and Matheson, growing up doesn't mean succumbing to despair. Elliot has to grow up, he has to let E.T. go home, but only so E.T., the embodiment of childhood, can go on living.
He's a man from outer space, and we're taking him to a spaceship.
Well, can't he just beam up?
This is reality, Greg.
The climactic bike chase is both another display of powerful filmmaking and another symbol of the story's central thesis. By abandoning the adult vehicle for children's bikes, Elliot et al. Can cross boundaries and take paths which the government agents can't in their big bulky cars, to the point where they literally take flight by the end. For such a relatively small-scale action sequence, Spielberg gets an incredible amount of mileage out of it, but it's John Williams' score which propels it to soaring operatic heights. Much like the climax to Close Encounters, the final scene of E.T. is such an incredible synthesis of visuals and music that it can transpire almost without any dialogue. It is raw, honest, sincere emotion on full display, and I have to admit, it always makes me cry. This film's message has truly resonated with me, though I didn't fully realize just how much until making this video. Consciously or not, I took this idea of holding on to my childhood to heart, and it has shaped my entire life ever since. Among my peers at school, I was the last to put down my toys, but in a sense, I never stopped playing. I still keep 2 action figures from my childhood next to my desk as a reminder of those more innocent times. My desire to become a filmmaker comes from my desire to imagine stories and play. I just got bigger toys. My determination to hold on to that part of myself is what motivated me to start this very YouTube channel, and keep at it even when I took on more adult responsibilities. And it's this same determination which continues to motivate me to make films. I can get bogged down in the mundanity of adult life from time to time, as everyone does, but thanks to movies like E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial, I've always remembered how important it is to keep imagining, to keep dreaming, and to keep believing in the impossible. Through this film and others like it, Steven Spielberg taught me that I should always remember how to look at the world the way only a child can, and that is a gift I will always cherish. Due to the more intimate nature of E.T. as a story and the smaller scale of its production, Spielberg, Kennedy and Marshall expected the film to be successful, but they were not expecting another blockbuster. Spielberg had already received some flack from some notable critics for his commercial sensibilities and overly sentimental storytelling. Yet when the movie premiered at Cannes, the filmmaker could sense even this audience was touched by his new film.
It was not until the Cannes Film Festival. It was almost a phenomenon, you know. We took the film out of competition to Cannes on the last night.
And about 15 minutes before the end of the movie, people started to clap and stomp their feet. And we thought, what is this? You know, because First of all, your stomach's churning and you're nervous and you think, oh my God, they don't like the movie. And then we realized it was just the opposite. They loved the movie.
I remember Steven sitting next to me and kept pounding on my leg. And in fact, I had black and blue marks because he kept squeezing and pounding, going, they're laughing, they like it, they like it.
I got this little telegram from Francois Truffaut, and the telegram, which meant so much to me, said, "You belong here more than me," echoing Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I mean, that just broke me up.
And I think that's when we just had a little hint that this might be kind of big.
The film debuted at the top of the box office when it was released in the US and spent an unprecedented total of 16 weeks at number 1. This record has still not been broken by any movie since. By the end of its theatrical run, E.T. had not only become a blockbuster hit, but it even surpassed Star Wars to become the highest grossing movie of all time, the second time a Spielberg film had achieved that feat. And it wasn't just a commercial success. Critics were won over by Spielberg's technical mastery and storytelling prowess. For audiences, E.T. was a cultural touchstone, and despite the prominence of Americana, it was clear the film resonated with millions all across the world. It was nominated for 9 Oscars and won 4, including Best Original Score, which was John Williams' 3rd Academy Award win. E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial's fingerprints can be found across movies, TV shows, and video games too numerous to count. 2011 saw a double bill of E.T.-inspired films, including the comedy Paul, which directly references the film via a Spielberg voice cameo. And later, Spielberg produced J.J. Abrams' riff on a similar concept in Super 8. More recently, the Netflix hit Stranger Things drew heavy inspiration from E.T., even going so far as to include a chase sequence where the main characters flee from government agents on their bikes, aided by telekinetic powers. Following E.T.'s success, Spielberg directed and/or produced hit after hit throughout the 80s and 90s. Not only did he direct 2 successful sequels to Raiders of the Lost Ark, but he also pivoted into well-received period drama films like The Color Purple and Empire of the Sun. Spielberg's companies Amblin Entertainment and the later DreamWorks also produced hits such as Richard Donner's The Goonies, Robert Zemeckis' Back to the Future trilogy, as well as The Mask of Zorro and Galaxy Quest, just to name a few. However, not all of his directorial efforts met with universal success. The romantic fantasy film Always divided critics, and Hook, while a box office success, was panned. Hook in particular was a difficult production for Spielberg and many others. It was the first of his films since 1941 to go over budget and fall behind schedule. He later reflected that he was unhappy with Hook, and regretted his frustrations on set, which saw him clash with several cast members, and swear never to work with child actors again. Then 45 years old, perhaps Steven Spielberg had grown out of his childlike disposition, and instead his subsequent films pivoted into darker, more adult territory. Though he would still wow audiences with Jurassic Park, the third of his films to become the highest grossing of all time, Spielberg seemed to grow more interested in period dramas like Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, and Amistad. But as the new millennium approached, Spielberg's friend and fellow filmmaker Stanley Kubrick approached him with a new science fiction project. The 2001 A Space Odyssey director pitched it to Spielberg as a sci-fi fairy tale inspired by Pinocchio. With such a kid-friendly undertone to the project, could Spielberg once again capture that childlike sense of wonder, or would his darker instincts take over? Thank you for watching. If you liked this video and want to see more like it, early, uncut, and ad-free, then hop over to my Patreon page where you can support the channel more directly. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank all of my patrons and members whose names are currently on your screen. I'd also like to say an ultra thanks to Retro PC Gamer, Benjamin Stokes, Hiroshi the Dog, Movie Magic, Charles Borsam, Olivia Computer, Bano, Dent the Air, Extreme Streamers, Tom, Dusk, Colin Camille, Patrick Fleming, Matthew Camille, Ed Mark Starr, Dylan Thomas, Lilac Yane, Howard Craig Kervik, and Kajing G. Thank you once again for watching, and until next time,